Trump's Epstein problems just got worse as you had Epstein survivors speaking out today, dropping a bombshell, and top MAGA stood against the president. What's really going on with Trump in Venezuela after he blew up that boat, killing 11 people? Florida is planning to end all state vaccine mandates, including for kids to attend schools. And a comedian in the UK was arrested over social media posts sparking support and backlash, and now the Met police chief is calling for a review of the laws. We're talking about all of that and even more on today's brand new Philip DeFranco Show. You daily dive into the news, starting with this. We need to talk about these Epstein victims today, starting with the fact that whatever they said yesterday, it drove Nancy Mace into a full-blown panic attack. Because it members of the House Oversight Committee meeting yesterday behind closed doors with 6 of Epstein's victims, and Mace was spotted leaving early with tears streaming down her face. With her later saying on X, as a recent survivor, I had a very difficult time listening to their stories. Full-blown panic attack, sweating, hyperventilating, shaking, I can't breathe. With her adding, I feel the immense pain of how hard all victims are fighting for themselves because we know absolutely no one will fight for us. Right in her committee, they've been waiting for the DOJ to comply with its subpoena for the full Epstein files for weeks at this point. So far, they've only gotten 33,000 pages, which they just released to the public last night. But also a key thing there is that according to the Democrats on the committee, 97% of the documents were already publicly available. And in fact, according to reports, even some of those appear to be more heavily redacted now than they were when Attorney General Pam Bondi released them earlier this year. And then as far as the 3% that's new, reports say that it's mostly just logs of flight locations for Epstein's plane. Though we also got some more footage from the camera outside of Epstein's cell block the night that he died, which, according to Fox News, fills in the notorious missing minute just before midnight. Footage that also contradicts Bondi's previous claim that the same minute gets deleted every night during a reset. Though it's also unclear why she would lie about that, since it appears that the minute doesn't actually show anything notable anyway. Now, with all that said, according to a committee spokesperson, more files are supposed to be forthcoming from the DOJ, but critics have alleged that the White House is simply stalling to buy time. Or because Congress, they have to pass a funding bill by the end of this month to prevent a government shutdown. And so this whole Epstein file situation, it threatens to block that from happening. And so you have many suspecting that Trump's DOJ, they're trickling out information to make it seem like they're being transparent when they're really not. Which is then also why Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna have launched a full-scale pressure campaign against the White House and their fellow lawmakers to make sure that this issue doesn't disappear. Right? And they're seeking to pass what's called a discharge petition that would force the government to release the Epstein files. And apparently it's this close to happening. Because you have this pair announcing this morning that 212 Democrats and 4 Republicans have signed on, including Massie himself, Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Meaning that as I'm recording this, only 2 more lawmakers in the House have to get on board and this thing would pass. So then after that, it would have to go through the Republican-controlled Senate and get signed by Donald Trump, which seems very unlikely. Especially as you had a White House official saying, quote, helping Thomas Massie and liberal Democrats with this would be viewed as a very hostile act to the administration. And actually, one of the arguments we're seeing here is that even if Donald Trump doesn't sign it, at least the entire country will see him not sign it. They will see him and each and every lawmaker who voted no. And their usual excuse that the petition, it doesn't protect the victims who are in the files, it could be a lot harder to rely on after today. Right in that, because this morning, Massie and Khanna brought a group of Epstein's victims, some of whom had never spoken out publicly before, to Capitol Hill to have their voices heard. And for an hour and a half, they unloaded years of anger, sadness, and frustration, and we saw the victim's lawyer going first.
All of the documents and evidence that we have worked so hard to gather hide behind protective orders, confidentiality agreements, and bank secrecy laws. That is why this discharge petition is so important. While we have seen the documents, you haven't. And when you see the documents, you're going to be appalled.
And as far as these women, you saw them stressing that this isn't about partisan politics.
Mr. President Donald J. Trump, I am a registered Republican, not that that matters because this is not political. However, I cordially invite you to the Capitol to meet me in person so you can understand this is not a hoax. We are real human beings.
Though also on the note of the president, you had one of the survivors making sure to make this comment.
Jeffrey and Ghislaine were always very boastful about their friends, their famous or powerful friends. And his biggest brag forever was that he was very good friends with Donald Trump. He had an 8x10 framed picture of him on his desk with the 2 of them.
And you had most of them talking about how releasing these files would not only show Americans the truth, but also it would help the victims heal their trauma.
The worst part is that the government is still in possession right now of the documents and information about that could help me remember and get over all of this maybe and help me heal. They have documents with my name on them that were confiscated from Jeffrey Epstein's house and could help me put the pieces of my own life back together. But I don't have any of it.
It's about the weight we live with daily. It is about the families broken and the future stolen. So I ask you, President Trump and members of Congress, why do we continue to cover up sexual abuse and assault? Who are we covering for?
You also had the late Virginia Giuffre's brother giving this incredibly emotional, impassioned plea to the government.
Whether you're a dad, a mom, a brother, or a sister, look your young ones in the face look them in the eye and tell them you didn't stand against the very people who raped, molested, and preyed upon children and young women. If you vote no, your stance will be clear. But here's my one ask. Look these survivors in the eye and tell them why.
And you had several others echoing that demand as well.
It's time you do is right by us. Unseal all the documents. We are requesting transparency. And I am requesting every congressman and woman that goes against this bill be outed. I want to know.
And to be clear, the only motive for opposing this bill would be to conceal wrongdoing. You have a choice. Stand with the truth or with the lies that have protected predators for decades.
But then also, in what may have been the biggest bombshell of the morning, one victim revealed that they have the Epstein client list, not the actual list, if that even exists, but rather.
I would like to announce here today, us Epstein survivors have been discussing creating our own list. We know the names. Many of us were abused by them. Now, together as survivors, we will confidentially compile the names we all know.
And then with all that, you had the lawyer adding.
When they reached a certain age, he did farm a section of them, some of them, out to some of his friends. That doesn't mean all of his friends. And we've talked to them about the various people that they were farmed out to. So we've created somewhat of a list. Most of these individuals, the victims, are very scared to say these names because they could get sued. They're going to get attacked. And nobody protected them the first time.
And then finally, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, I mean, her involvement here is massive. She seems MAGA through and through. She always seems like the president's biggest cheerleader, though she's standing against him in this. And she closed out the event saying,
yeah, it's a scary thing to name names, but I will tell you, I'm not afraid to name names. And so if they want to give me a list, I will walk in that Capitol on the House floor and I'll say every damn name that abused these women.
But, we'll have to see if that pressure's enough to make any Republicans buckle, because remember, they only need 2 more to sign the petition. And today you had Representative Victoria Spartz, who attended the conference, telling reporters she's still deciding whether to do it or not. Right, and this also is House Speaker Mike Johnson, who said he's too busy to even attend this morning's conference, reiterating his opposition to the petition, saying it does not adequately protect victims. And because we have so much compassion for the victims, those who spoke today, and the estimated maybe as many as 1,000 victims total, we have to be very diligent about protecting their identities. And according to The Hill, he gathered GOP leadership in the basement of the Capitol for a closed-door meeting today and implored them not to sign the petition. And then, separate from that, you had Donald Trump being asked for his reaction to everything that's happened, and he said this.
So this is a Democrat hoax that never ends. It reminds me a little of the Kennedy situation. We gave him everything over and over again, more and more and more. And nobody's ever satisfied. I understand that we were subpoenaed to give files, and I understand we've given thousands of pages of files. And I know that no matter what you do, it's going to keep going. And I think it's enough, because I think we should talk about the greatness of our country and the success that we're having.
And so then someone went back to Mike Johnson and asked, hey, do you agree with Trump that this is a hoax? And we saw...
I'm not sure what that comment refers to, but I've spoken to the president myself about this many times, and he is insistent as we are. He is the most transparent president in memory, probably in the history of the country. As you know, he stops. If he were here now, he would stand here and take your questions endlessly. Now, he also, just as we do, is insistent that we protect the innocent victims, and that's what this has been about.
But of course, you have critics countering that Trump and the DOJ, they're not actually protecting the victims. They're protecting their reputations. And you had Massey making that argument today, pointing to a flight log release last night in which all the names are redacted, which is then why he says that Johnson is naive to think they can trust the White House to release all the files, and they instead need to be forced to do so. As we wait to see how this plays out, you have Trump deflecting and dodging. I'd really love to know your thoughts, opinions, and reactions to what we're seeing today. Because whether it be with his first big story or anything else that stands out to you today, I'd love to hear from you. Yes, this is a news show, but it's also a conversation. But then next up from that, we should talk about how the U.S. military just blew up 11 people on a boat in the Caribbean Sea. Now, they were probably criminals, but there also wasn't a trial or any sort of evidence presented. Instead, you just had the Trump administration calling them narco-terrorists and saying that this is the beginning. And you've got all of that raising concerns about a possible military confrontation with Venezuela, which... let me explain. Right, so we actually first learned about the attack during Trump's address at the White House yesterday, where he was announcing Space Command HQ in Alabama. Also was kind of a little bit of a proof of life, but he said...
when you come out and when you leave the room, you'll see that we just, over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat.
And then you quickly had Secretary of State Marco Rubio giving some additional information on a post on X, writing, as POTUS just announced moments ago, today the U.S. military conducted a lethal strike in the southern Caribbean against a drug vessel which had departed from Venezuela and was being operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization. With then Trump posting a video on Truth Social that appeared to show the strike, then alleging that those targeted had been positively identified Tren de Aragua narco-terrorists, and adding, the strike occurred while the terrorists were at sea in international waters transporting illegal narcotics heading to the United States. The strike resulted in 11 terrorists killed in action. Right, and all of this very notable for a number of reasons, including that this is a massive shift away from how the U.S. would normally deal with it. Because in the past, American authorities have focused on seizing the drugs, identifying suspects, building a criminal case, and not just blowing them out of the water. And at least according to Trump, there's more where that came from. And while a senior official also told the New York Times there would be additional attacks against cartel boats in the future, notably, the White House still hasn't explained how the military determined that those aboard the first boat were actually cartel members. Plus, you're seeing defense officials declining to address almost any questions about what went down, including, 1, the amount of drugs on board, 2, whether they tried to stop the boat first, communicate with it in any way, or otherwise give them a chance to surrender before striking with deadly force, and 3, what legal authority they're using to justify the strike. And with all that, you have experts saying that this may be a violation of international and human rights law, though to be fair, it's not necessarily one that we didn't see coming. Because back in July, you had Trump signing a secret directive greenlighting military force against those drug cartels that his administration had deemed terrorist organizations. And since then, you've had the Pentagon bolstering their presence in the Caribbean, sending warships and thousands of troops to the region. And also, all of that, it's just one part of a pressure campaign on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Right, and there you've had the White House upping the reward for information leading to Maduro's arrest on years-old charges related to narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and corruption to $50 million, further alleging that Maduro and other high-ranking Venezuelan officials are in charge of Venezuela's Cartel of the Suns. They also announced new sanctions against the organization, as well as adding it to the country's list of foreign terrorist organizations. So notably, the Cartel of the Suns, at least according to many experts, it doesn't actually exist. Instead, those experts agree that there isn't a single organized group with a defined hierarchy that goes by that name. And actually, instead, according to one think tank, the Cartel of the Suns is more accurately described as a system of corruption wherein military and political officials profit by working with drug traffickers. And actually, similarly, while you've had Trump claiming Tren de Aragua is operating under the control of Nicolas Maduro, that's a claim that's been directly contradicted by a declassified U.S. intelligence assessment, which said that Maduro's government, quote, probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA and is not directing TDA movement to and operations in the United States. Instead, according to the report, the Venezuelan regime, while sometimes tolerating the gang's activities, largely views it as a potential security threat. But with all that said, and this is a very key thing, that does not mean that military personnel, government officials, or even Maduro himself are not involved in or benefiting from drug trafficking. But it's at the very least just one reason that you have some believing this is about more than just drugs. With actually another reason connected to that being that Venezuela isn't even the biggest source of drugs coming into the U.S. In fact, while the Trump administration's allegations against Maduro have focused on cocaine, according to the DEA's own annual report, 84% of the cocaine seized in the U.S., it actually comes from Colombia, mostly being trafficked through Ecuador, Central America, and Mexico. And so then with all that, you have Maduro accusing the Trump administration of pushing for regime change, saying this week that Trump needs to take care because Marco Rubio wants to stain his hands with blood, and adding, they want to lead you into a bloodbath with a massacre against the people of Venezuela. And regarding Rubio, he's long been one of the most vocal critics of Maduro. And he's become the architect of Trump's policy toward Venezuela. And in 2018, during Trump's first term, he actually said that there was a strong argument to be made for the use of military in the country. And it appears that he has not changed his view there, with him recently being asked about whether Trump would carry out operations on Venezuelan soil. And he responded, we're going to take on drug cartels wherever they are and wherever they're operating against the interests of the United States. That said, you also have many experts skeptical that the U.S. is actually planning a military intervention. With, for example, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council telling The Guardian, this is not a deployment focused on regime change. This may be an attempt to signal to disaffected elements of the military in Venezuela that now is the time to rise up against Maduro. But we've seen that approach be tried and fail repeatedly over the last 25 years. But ultimately, for now, we're going to have to wait to see what happens here, and maybe even more importantly, how it goes down. But then, really quick, in a 1-minute break that keeps the show free for you, let me ask you an honest question. How many brilliant ideas do you feel like are just rotting away in your notes app right now? Because somewhere in that dusty graveyard of someday ideas lies your side hustle. And so why not? I want you to make today the day that you commit to taking that opportunity or that passion project to the next level. And I kid you not, the DeFranco Book Club, it went from someday to launched in under an hour with today's sponsor, Squarespace. Right? Because Squarespace, they make it easy to build a site where maybe you're just showcasing things, creating things, or you can start selling content, courses, physical, or even digital products, whatever you have in mind. Or you want to charge a one-time fee, offer a subscription, both? done and done. They've got beautiful templates that look like you hired a designer, and their Fluid Engine editor, it lets you drag, drop, customize, and all no coding, no stress, no excuses. I mean, we use it for a lot. My team uses Squarespace for our Daily Dip newsletter. Tens of thousands of you get your daily dip fix in your inbox every weekday. News, polls, giveaways, PDS show notes, all run through Squarespace. And like clockwork, a Daily Dip issue went out today and your project vision could be next. So hey, take the first step today with a free trial at squarespace.com/filler. Just scan that QR code. Make today launch day. Just remember that when it's ready to go, use code Phil to get 10% off and let them know we sent you. But then, getting back to the news, RFK needs to resign, and the Department of Energy, they're lying to you. Those are the two subjects and messages of two letters that were sent out to two government agencies this week. One from 1,000 HHS employees and the other from dozens of scientists. And let's start with Cheryl Hines' hubby, because this morning a group of more than 1,000 current and former Department of Health and Human Services employees signed a letter to Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. saying that his leadership has, quote, put the health of all Americans at risk, and they demanded his resignation. And to support their argument, they pointed to several of RFK's recent decisions, like the declared firing of CDC Director Dr. Susan Manaras and the subsequent resignation of 4 other senior officials within the agency. They also pointed to the appointment of what they called political ideologues to influential roles in vaccine policy and his decision to rescind emergency use authorizations for COVID-19 vaccines without providing any data to actually back that up. Also, if you're like, this sounds familiar, you're not crazy. This is not the first time that HHS employees have sent a letter to RFK. In fact, just a few weeks ago after the August 8th shooting at the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, which it feels like everyone's already forgotten about, over 700 employees signed a letter imploring RFK to, quote, stop spreading inaccurate health information and guarantee the safety of the HHS workforce. So with that, you had a spokesperson from the agency responding by saying that RFK stands firmly with CDC employees and, quote, any attempt to conflate widely supported public health reforms with the violence of a suicidal mass shooter is an attempt to politicize a tragedy. Now, with all this, as I'm recording, we've yet to see a response to this new letter, but RFK did publish an op-ed with the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying that his agency is, quote, restoring public trust in the CDC, something that he said was lost thanks to decades of bureaucratic inertia, politicized science, and mission creep, with him then also going on to defend his actions, defining them as steps taken to eliminate conflicts of interest and bureaucratic complacency. And while you have many of his critics saying that is not what he is actually doing, that tons of people are in more danger and could die in the future. On the topic of politicized science, we should talk about the Department of Energy's recent report on climate change, and more specifically, the rebuttal against it by dozens of scientists. And so first, I'll say back in July, the DOE published a report titled A Critical Review of Impacts of Greenhouse Gas Emissions on the U.S. Climate. And their key findings were that the carbon dioxide-induced warming, quote, appears to be less damaging economically than commonly believed, and that our efforts to mitigate CO2 emissions could be more harmful than helpful. And then it also said that any U.S. policy actions on climate change are expected to have, quote, undetectably small direct impacts on the global climate, and any effects will emerge only with long delays. Now, with all this, some key pieces of information to know is that there were 5 researchers handpicked to prepare this report by Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and all 5 of them have reportedly historically questioned the scientific consensus that climate change is a considerable threat. And even occasionally, reports say they frame global warming as a good thing. And so that is the baseline that we're working with here. And while the DOE had a 30-day open comment period on this report that closed yesterday, right before it closed, a group of more than 85 scientists submitted a scathing rebuttal of the report, saying, among other things, the DOE's analysis is riddled with errors, misrepresentations, and cherry-picked data to further Team Trump's political agenda. And I mean, what they gave us is a chapter-by-chapter criticism of the DOE's report, effectively serving as a peer review, resulting in a 439-page document. I mean, it's nearly 3 times the size of the original report. And so while obviously I'm not going to cover every single thing in all 400 pages, here are some of the highlights. The DOE report suggests that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that helps plants grow, and therefore more gas would improve agricultural yields. But the rebuttal says that the authors of the DOE report sidestep the negative impacts of global warming on plant life, like extreme heat, droughts, floods, and wildfires. Then you've got the 2 studies that the DOE cited by a professor of epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to support their argument that more people die from excessive cold than heat. And actually, to that point, that same professor responded saying that while that fact is true, the report ignores that global warming is increasing heat-related deaths at a rate faster than it would have prevented cold-related ones. The DOE report also did what one physics professor called a graphical sleight of hand in a chart showing yearly average atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And it appears they did so by omitting key data and making specific choices on the graph to make it seem like those levels had only slightly risen. And I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, the scientists compared this report to efforts by the tobacco industry to create doubt around the health links between smoking and cancer, writing, "No one should doubt that human-caused climate change is real, is already producing potentially dangerous impacts, and that humanity is on track for a geological enormous amount of warming." Right? And with all this, the scientist rebuttal was coordinated by Andrew Dessler, a professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University, who argues that the issues he and other scientists highlighted is incredibly important to pay attention to because of how the Trump administration is using this report. Right, and they're referring to the fact that the EPA has already used the DOE's conclusions as a justification to repeal the endangerment finding, which is a 2009 scientific declaration that climate change poses a danger to human health and welfare. And that finding, it serves as the basis for regulations on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, with Dessler adding, their goal was to muddy the waters, to put out a plausible sounding argument that people can use in the public debate to make it sound like we don't know whether climate change is bad or not. And with all that said, as far as the Department of Energy, they've responded to the scientist rebuttal with a spokesperson telling NPR that the report was reviewed internally by DOE scientific researchers and policy experts from the Office of Science and National Labs, which is also kind of a sticking point here because that's the excuse that one of the report's authors gave when asked about why they didn't get this report traditionally peer-reviewed. And you also had the department adding that the purpose of this report is to restore an open and transparent dialogue around climate scientists, and saying, following the public comment period, we look forward to reviewing and engaging on substantive comments. And notably, back when the report was initially published, you had Energy Secretary Chris Wright throwing a support behind it wholly and saying at the time, "I've reviewed the report carefully and I believe it faithfully represents the state of climate science today." And adding, still, many readers may be surprised by its conclusions, which differ in important ways from the mainstream narrative, and saying that's a sign of how far the public conversation has drifted from the science itself. And actually, since then, he's accused the report's critics of avoiding an in-depth conversation about the science surrounding global warming. But then, next up in the news, we gotta talk about this guy who was just arrested over his tweets. Right? And the situation has divided people because you have some arguing that the arrest here is justified because his tweets were an incitement to violence against trans people, but you also have others defending him, including even some of his critics. Right? And so as far as the guy in question, it's a man by the name of Graham Linehan. He's best known in the UK as the co-writer of UK sitcoms, including Father Ted and the IT Crowd. But now more recently, he's been in the spotlight because he's been extremely vocal on social media talking about trans people. With him, for example, writing in one post in April, if a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent, abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls. And now, that tweet, along with a couple others, are seemingly the reason for his arrest. Graham saying on Substack that 5 armed officers arrested him when he flew back into the UK yesterday, took him away, and questioned him about the posts. He then wrote that his blood pressure was over 200, what he called stroke territory, after being questioned, and that he had been taken to the hospital and kept under observation before being discharged and released on bail. With him then noting that the only condition for his release was that he could not post on X. And finally, he claimed that all of this, quote, proves one thing beyond doubt. The UK has become a country that is hostile to freedom of speech, hostile to women, and far too accommodating to the demands of violent, entitled, abusive men who've turned the police into their personal goon squad. Now, with all that, as far as their part, the police also released a statement that generally lined up with Graham's account, but they also said that he wasn't arrested just for tweets, but on suspicion of inciting violence. With them also noting that, quote, it is routine for officers policing airports to carry firearms, and saying these were not drawn or used at any point during the arrest. So then with all that, you had some people defending the police, with people like the new leader of Britain's Green Party calling Graham's post totally unacceptable and saying the arrest seemed proportionate, with also others on that side arguing that Graham's words could cause real harm, and they're pointing to police stats showing a rapid uptick in hate crimes against transgender people, pointing to things like in the 12 months that ended in March 2024, almost 4,800 hate crimes were recorded against trans people, up from 2,800 hate crimes in the 12 months that ended in March of 2021. And to that point, you have people noting that Graham's actually already scheduled to appear in court this week in connection to a separate case in which he's accused of harassing a transgender woman and damaging her phone, though that's a charge he's denied. But then with all of that, on the other side, you have people agreeing with Graham that this is an absurd infringement on free speech. With people like Harry Potter writer J.K. Rowling, for example, who's become known for her anti-trans activism, writing on X, what the fuck has the UK become? This is totalitarianism, utterly deplorable. You also had politicians jumping on the story, with the Conservative Party leaders saying sending 5 officers to arrest a man for a tweet isn't policing, it's politics. Saying under Labour, we routinely see burglary, knife crime, and assaults go unsolved, while resources are wasted on thought policing, claiming the Conservatives would stop this nonsense on day one and make public safety the first duty of policing instead of pandering to fringe ideologies. But also, and I think very notably here, you had people like a staff writer for The Atlantic who's openly criticized Graham coming out against his arrest and saying that Europe really does have a free speech problem along with the US. And in fact, we're now actually seeing the police saying it may have gone too far, with the head of London's Metropolitan Police calling for the government to change or clarify the UK's law regarding free speech, saying that Graham's arrest lines up with what the law technically says, but adding, most reasonable people would agree that genuine threats of physical violence against an identified person or group should be acted upon by officers. Such actions can and do have serious and violent real-world implications. But when it comes to lesser cases where there is ambiguity in terms of intent and harm, policing has been left between a rock and a hard place by successive governments who have given officers no choice but to record such incidents as crimes when they're reported. Then they're obliged to follow all lines of inquiry and take action as appropriate. With him then going on to say, I don't believe we should be policing toxic culture war debates, and officers are currently in an impossible position. Greater clarity and common sense would enable us to limit the resources we dedicate to tackling online statements to those cases creating real threats in the real world. And so with all that said, this is going to be a really interesting one to watch. Do we actually see law changes? What happens with the arrest? And in the meantime, as we wait to see how this plays out, I'd really love to know your thoughts here in those comments down below. But then next up today, let's talk about more news you need to know, but kind of go rapid fire. Florida is now working hard to make the state a safer place by making it a breeding ground for diseases that have long been under control. With Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo announcing today that the state was moving to ban all vaccine mandates. It's not just COVID, all of them.
Every last one of them is wrong and drips with disdain and slavery. Okay? Who am I as a government or anyone else, or who am I as a man standing here now to tell you what you should put in your body? Who am I to tell you what your child should put in your body? I don't have that right. Your body is a gift from God. What you put into your body, is because of your relationship with your body and your God.
Right, all of this would be a pretty dramatic departure from current Florida law, which mandates vaccines in children in order for them to go to public schools. So to be clear, the state would just be banning mandates and not the vaccines themselves. So still with that, you had health experts warning this will be dangerous, noting that vaccines help populations reach herd immunity, which doesn't mean 100% of the population is safe. Instead, it covers over 90% of the population, giving wiggle room for the handful of people who can't get a vaccine for one reason or another. And then below that threshold, various diseases can still spread despite chunks of the population being immune, putting those who want to be protected but can't because of one reason or another, such as an allergy to a vaccine, being in danger. Which is why you have many experts saying we should expect to see a huge uptick of communicable and otherwise preventable diseases. We're talking about even maybe polio or measles. And all of this is, I think, why we're seeing states like California, Oregon, and Washington working on unified vaccine recommendations to try and mitigate the spread of such diseases on the West Coast. Then you had Missouri legislators kicking off a special session today to redraw the state's congressional maps in favor of Republicans. Right just hours after Texas enacted its new map that could give the Republicans 5 new seats, Missouri's Republican Governor Mike Kehoe called a special session starting today for a rare mid-decade redistricting, which makes Missouri the now 3rd state to officially start the process after Texas and California. Now, notably in Missouri, Republicans already control 6 of the state's 8 congressional seats, but now this new map, it would help them gain a 7th by splitting up the 5th congressional district in Kansas City, which is currently held by a Democrat. You know, Kehoe is not even trying to pretend that this is about anything more than shoring up Republican support, arguing that the new map is necessary to truly put Missouri values first, and adding that the state's, quote, conservative common sense values should be truly represented at all levels of government. So that appears to be bullshit because in statewide elections last year, 40% of Missourians voted for Democrats. And so it appears that this is just another step in the gerrymandering war that Texas kicked off. Then you've got Shein using Luigi Mangioni's face to sell clothes on its website. This blew up as TMZ reported on this listing, which shows what appears to be him in a white floral button-down priced at $11, which is kind of wild since you probably know that Luigi, who's accused of shooting the CEO of United Healthcare, is currently in jail in New York, and I imagine it would be pretty hard for him to land modeling contracts from behind bars. And so when people saw this image, there was a ton of backlash. People accusing Shein of using AI to turn Luigi into a model. Others saying that he should sue, that it's not right for a brand to use any incarcerated individual's face in this way. So you had TMZ noting it was unclear if it was AI, Photoshop, or maybe even a doppelganger, but the frenzy, it caused enough of a stir that the shirt nearly sold out. Now for their part, Shein told BBC News that the company did not use his likeness on purpose, saying the image in question was provided by a third-party vendor and was removed immediately upon discovery, saying we have stringent standards for all listings on our platform. And you have Shein saying they're conducting an investigation and saying appropriate action would be taken against the vendor in question. And then as far as the shirt, apparently it came from the brand Manfinity, which has a collection with Shein, and according to 404 Media, it lists a lot of items using AI-generated models. Then in social media influencer news, Mr. Beast is apparently considering launching his own cell phone servicing company, or with Business Insider obtaining a leaked investor deck from earlier this this year, laying out the plans. And while there's no exact timeline, the deck put a launch date at some point in 2026. As far as how it actually worked, Mr. Beast wouldn't need to build up a whole network from the ground up and instead would partner with existing providers like Verizon and T-Mobile. I think Ryan Reynolds and Mint Mobile, which actually previously sold to T-Mobile, which is also a company that Mr. Beast has notably worked with in marketing campaigns before. Then in legal entertainment news, Cardi B is innocent. Or at least I'll say that's what she said when she walked out of court today, though technically speaking, she was found not liable. Right in this, after last week, she had been on trial because a security guard filed a civil suit claiming that Cardi had assaulted her at a doctor's office back in 2018. You know, we covered it a bit. The trial also went very viral because of moments like this.
Did you call her fat?
No, I was calling her a bitch.
When I'm talking to you now, are we having a verbal altercation?
We'll see, a debate.
And the news today is that a California jury unanimously decided in favor of Cardi. And while speaking to reporters outside of the courthouse, she said,
I will say it in my deathbed. I did not touch that woman. I did not touch that girl. I know I got a little reputation, but I swear to God, I'm innocent.
Well, you know, the internet, they love seeing the clips and watching the trial. Cardi, she made it clear that she did not have a good time. And seemingly, she wanted to dissuade anyone from doing anything that would result in a sequel.
The next person to try to do a frivolous lawsuit against me, I'm going to countersue. And I'm going to make you pay. I am not that celeb that you're going to sue and you think it's going to settle. I'm not going to settle.
But then Cardi also notably telling her fans to not stalk or harass the woman who sued her in the case and asking that they leave the woman and her family alone so this can remain in the past. But then from that, finally today, I want to end with a congratulations and one more thing. Starting with a congratulations to Susanna, our SeatGeek's latest weekly winner who just snagged $500 in tickets to go see Chappell Roan. And for the rest of y'all, that's right. SeatGeek is still giving away $500 in tickets and you should definitely enter today if you haven't already. I mean, you could be the next winner and snag $500 towards seeing your favorite artist, sporting event, or play. I mean, there's like over 70,000 events to choose from. And all you got to do is add code PDS to your SeatGeek app profile for a chance at the weekly $500 prize, so no purchase necessary. But with that said, my one more thing I wanted to include for you today was a very important bit from former senior national correspondent at ABC News, Terry Moran, who I recently spoke with on my podcast In Good Faith, because I think that it connects with what I've seen a lot of you are feeling and what some of you have said about why your news diets have changed over the years, especially as we're seeing U.S. and international situations play out during Trump 2.0. And for me, it was something that I think was very important to hear from someone like him who's been a part of the machine and was also cast out for calling it as he saw it.
Business that I was in for all those years, network news, corporate media, legacy media, whatever you want to call it, is failing the American people. And they have corporate pressure on them. And they have kind of rules of what they can say and what they can't say, what they can describe and what they can't describe. The facts in front of them are eluding their coverage. And I think that they are disserving the American people. I know that there's frustration there. I know that people look at what they're doing and are like, this is not enough. You know, they try to put it in their tone sometime as they read their piece or they speak to camera, but they can't say the words of what's happening. And that's corporate pressure. Look, Disney, I mean, is a multi-billion-dollar business, right? The ABC News, a little tiny speck in that giant empire. The last thing that the head of Disney or anybody in these corporate offices wants is a problem with the president of the United States because somebody in the news division tweeted something. I mean, there's absolutely no upside to that. And so the pressure's on.